Penn Central. Yeah, you were a railroad. A semi-successful railroad. So, what was Penn Central? And why did they not last so long? Before merging, Penn Central was made up between two railroads, the Pennsylvania Railroad and the New York Central system. These two would merge. Later, the New Haven Railroad joining them to merge. These three railroads offered pretty much the same thing: a fast express passenger and commuter rail service, and railway express freight. The Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized the construction of the interstate highway system, which boosted trucking industry. This was a problem at the time for railroads. U.S. railroads were registered by the ICC, this meant railroads were not allowed to change rates from shipping freight or passenger cost, and that was the only way to survive and be profitable at the time. But the ICC restricted cost cutting that would take place. A merger reducing costs was the only way to survive these trying times. So on February 1st, 1968, the Pennsylvania Railroad, New York Central Railroad, and New Haven were all merged to create Penn Central. The new company took over freight and passenger operations of the bankrupt New York Central, New Haven, and Hartford later on December 31st, 1968. Penn Central absorbed the New York Susquehanna Western Railway. They could not agree on a price. Eventually, the New York Susquehanna would become a part of the Delaware system. The merger was not a success. An implement of a plan was drawn up, but not carried out. Attempts to streamline the operation failed. Due to corporate cultures, unavailable computer systems, and union contracts, little was given to the two railroads. Then they both had different styles of operation prior to the merge. The New York Central had its physical plant and assembled young management and young and eager management groups under the leadership of Alfred E. Perlman. The PR, on the other hand, by Stewart Sanders, had more of a conversational and traditional operations. Many of the New York Central's management people was known as the Green Team, while the PRR was saw as the Red Team. And Penn Central management soon left for other positions. Those who had departed often said different corporate facilities branded itself as a transportation company. The New York Central considered itself a railroad company. They could have never merged successfully. The network was so poorly that trains were lost on a regular basis. Clerks struggled to properly dispatch cars. And another thing Penn Central was known well for was their derailments. There was an approximately 256 derailments per year. The last 3 years of Penn Central's operations, there were known to be almost 300. In addition to these problems, unification and the industrial states of the Northeast and Midwest were fast becoming the rusty bones. As industries shut it down and relocated, Penn Central and many other railroads found themselves with excess capacity of trackage. The PR was particularly burdened with excess trackage. In many cases, they had 4 to 6 lines of track where 1 or 2 would really need it. Even though this track was no longer needed, it was still on the tax rolls west of the Allegheny Mountains. The New York Central and Pennsylvania Railroad duplicated each other at almost in every major point east of the Alleghenies. The two hardly touched. Due to the subpar track conditions, this deteriorated, particularly in the Midwest, resulting in duplicated facilities. Trains regularly operated at greatly reduced speeds, delayed shipments, excessive overtime, accurate and operating costs soared. Derailments, wrecks were regular occurrences, particularly in the Midwest in the 1969. Most of the main potato production rotted in Penn Central's Selleck Yard, which is a yard in service by NS. More on that later. Hurting many of short lines. Those who shipped through Penn Central vowed to never ship by rail again. At one point, Penn Central was losing $1 million per day, but this was reduced a few years later. A few years too late, honestly. Penn Central tried to diversify the troubled firm into real estate and non-railroad ventures, but in a slow economy, these businesses performed a little better than the railroad's assets. In addition, new subdirects were diverted management attention away from the problems in the core business. Management also insisted on paying dividends and shareholders to create the illusion of success. The company had to borrow additional funds and maintain operations. Interest on loans had become unbearable and a financial burden. The Pennsylvania Railroad and New York Central system came into merger in the black, but Penn Central's first year operation deflected of $2.8 million, or $21.8 million in today. But in 1969, it was nearly $83 million, or $613 million of today. Penn Central's net income for the 1970s was defecated of $325.8 million, or $2.27 billion today. By then, the railroad had entirely bankrupted its proceedings, especially on June 21st, 1970. The nation's sixth largest corporation had become the largest bankruptcy. Although Penn Central was in the bankruptcy, its parent, the Penn Central Company, was able to survive. This had devastating effects of a Hurricane Agnes in 1972, which further hammered Penn Central's operation, destroying many important branches and main lines and terminals. In order for funds to continue operation, the result lawsuit, Penn Central Transport Company versus New York City, was decided in 1978. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Penn Central could not sell Grand Central Station's air rights because it was the terminal, a New York Central designated landmark. And in May 1974, Penn Central was not recognizable on the basis of income. A U.S. government corporation, the U.S. Railway Association, was formed under the provisions of Regional Railroads Reorganization. The Act of 1973, a plan to save Penn Central. The outcome was that Consolidated Rail Corporation, or better known as Conrail. It was owned by the U.S. government and took over the railroad properties and operations of Penn Central and 6 other railroads: Lehigh Hudson River Railway, Central Railroad of New Jersey, Pennsylvania Reading Seashore Line. And on April 1st, 1976, it was a major step towards the nationalization of the railroads in the U.S. They had been nationalized briefly during World War I, but the U.S. held out against worldwide and trend nationalization of the railroads until the creation of Amtrak in 1971. However, this was not the end of Penn Central. Penn Central shops were still building locomotives. Penn Central inherited Metroliners and many other electric trains. The PRR and US DOT had begun to experiment with fast electrical trains that were able to be the maximum speed of 160 miles per hour, or 257 kilometers per hour. The The service was delayed several times, but when it did begin, it was not showing many success. The Metroliner was not an absolute success, but a revised long decline of ridership, the New York-Washington run. Another type of locomotive they built was the turbo train, an effort to be a 3-hour and 55-minute running time of the New Haven's Express in the early 1950s. The information about the turbo train was more difficult to the public to maintain than the Metroliner turntables. The combined option of unusable by equipment and the track that was allowed to just sit there and rot, and many other factors meant passengers would refuse to ride. With some Metroliners being scrapped or turned into cab cars by Amtrak, the turbo trains were not as lucky. They were all scrapped altogether. Penn Central's intercity service was taken over by Amtrak on May 1st, 1971. The commuter service, which is substantially approved by the local authorities, passed it first to Conrail, then they passed it to SEPTA, New Jersey Transit, Metro-North Railroad, then Amtrak. With Penn Central pretty much losing all of their railroading market, they were still losing cost of their trucking market industry. The railroad industry and its unions asked the federal government for the 1980s Staggers Act, which delegated railroad industries proved to be a key factor of bringing Conrail and its old Penn Central assets back to life during the 80s. While Penn Central's railroad did go file for bankruptcy and closed in 1976, the truck industry, however, lasted longer, not too long. Within a few months of the same year, they also would close in 1976. With Penn Central now being bought out by Conrail, Conrail had the muscle to imply the roots in regionalization and productivity that Penn Central had unsuccessfully tried to compete with other railroads. Between 1968 and 1970, 100 miles of former Pennsylvania Railroad tracks and New York Central System tracks were abandoned and left to landowners or rail trail use, or which means when they get turned into bike trails or any other things. The stocks was profitable by Conrail. Conrail was refloated on Wall Street in 1987. The company operated as an independent private sector railroad from 1987 to 1999, which was later, in 1999, Conrail would later become Norfolk Southern. As of May 23rd, 2022, Penn Central has been revised as the Penn Central Transit Corporation, based in Marysville, Pennsylvania. As for legacy, the Penn Central bankruptcy was a catastrophic event to both the railroad industry and the nation's business community. Penn Central and its problems have been the subject of more words than almost anything in the railroad industry, mostly through humor and just a lot of inside jokes about Penn Central's management. In addition to overcoming obstacles, the principal problem was too much government region and passenger deflect, which amounted to more than $100 million a year. As the mega railroad's brief existence has rarely been looked on favorably by the railroad historians and former employees, almost nothing specifically aimed at the railroad's enthusiast has been published about Penn Central. The preservation group Penn Central Railroad Historical Society was formed in July 2000 to preserve the history of the often-soaring company. On Norfolk Southern's 30th anniversary, the railroad painted 20 new locomotives utilizing the former liveries of their predecessor railroads. Unit number 1037 and SD-70 AC is Penn and Penn Central's heritage scheme. I mean, they could have done Penn Central's green, but I mean, I don't know. I think it would look nice. While Penn Central was gone, this doesn't mean you can still see some locomotives kicking it. Ex-Conrail is an ex-Penn Central 2185, which is now owned by Burlington Northern, which now is ex-BN, ex-Conrail, ex-Penn Central, which is owned by BNSF. It is a GP38 that went through Penn Central, Conrail, Burlington Northern. Now it's in the hands of BNSF. Penn Central 5599, an Alcon RS3 that was used by New Haven, that is preserved in the Berkshire Scenic Railway Museum, which you can still see today. But probably the most famous one out of all of them is ex-Penn Central, New York Central 4083. And it was an EMD-E8 painted in New York Central's green. It was painted in a prototype green. I believe it was called Midnight Green or Express Green. But it was actually one of the inspirations for one of Penn Central's green liveries. This E8 can be seen at the United Railroad Historic Society of New Jersey. A small electric diesel Penn Central 4715 ex-New York Central is actually preserved in the Illinois Railway Museum, where it sits on static display. An ex-PRR Pennsylvania Railroad ex-Penn Central number 4845 GG1 is also preserved, but it's in better conditions, at least to say at the time of this video. But one thing this locomotive was known for is actually when Flying Scotsman did its tour in the States, it was one of the GG1s that pulled it due to basically, at the time, cities were not allowed steam locomotives, as it would clog up smoke and all that. If there's a word you can describe Penn Central with, it's wow. It's just unexplainable. But if you could explain it now, I'd personally say more profit equals less money, due to Penn Central taking out all their loans and falling into bankruptcy. But now, while some Penn Central locomotives were not as lucky and were scrapped, we still have old footage to remember them by. And well, Penn Central is iconic, being well known for their derailments. And I guess we can poke fun at management. And Penn Central is one of the great examples of why two different companies might not have the same views. While Penn Central, some lessons were learned by Penn Central. Again, the management part, not really. As when Southern Pacific tried to merge with Santa Fe, and while they may have ran the same lines, but their management did not get along with each other as well. Penn Central will always be one of those railroads that you have to look back on and just say, wow, they took two beautiful railroads, well, three, but I don't care for New Haven, honestly. They took several railroads and just smushed them together and threw them into a blender, and there you go. You have Penn Central. Don't breathe that, because Penn Central was bad. Honestly, do I have anything else to say? Yes. While the government doesn't play much roles, and with merging railroads and much really at all, they still seem to have interest in railroads. And one thing to think of, if Penn Central was never created, who knows what could happen. Maybe one of the railroads, maybe the Pennsylvania Railroad would have been around today. Maybe New York Central Railroad system would have been around today. All we know is Penn Central was turned into Conrail. Conrail was split between CSX and NS, and many and short lines, and those few created many rivalries, some that are still going to this day. This has been Creative Communists talking about Penn Central and their bankruptcy. Remember, more profit equals less money.